This presentation, titled The Future of Food Safety Audits, Is Technology the Answer?, comes to us from Bill McBride. Bill is the principal of FoodLink Asia Pacific, based in Sydney, Australia. For the past 10 years, Bill has served as the Asia Pacific representative for the SQF Institute, supporting the growth of the SQF program in Australia, New Zealand, and Eastern Asia. He won the SQFI Distinguished Service Award in 2015 and is a key member of the SQF technical team. Bill is a 40-year veteran of the food industry with experience in food industry change management, food safety certification, quality assurance, international food standards, GFSI, training, consulting, and auditing. He is the former chair of the GFSI Working Group on Auditor Competence, as well as the past chairman of the personnel certification body, QSA International. And with that, take it away, Bill.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you to Exemplar for the opportunity to speak once again at the Food Safety Expo. As Mike indicated, I have been around for a fair little while, and so I do have a little bit of history in this business. And as Mike also indicated, I am, and some of you would know me, as the Asia Pacific representative for the SQF program and have been since 2010. However, I do need to stress that the views that I'm expressing in this presentation are my personal views and not those of SQFI or its parent company, the Food Marketing Institute, now known as the Food Industry Association. But when we look at the future of food safety auditing, you can Google it, you'll get 1,000 different views on the future of food safety auditing. My views might be a little bit, out of the box, might be a little bit different, but they're just out there as a conversation starter because I guess in my view, something does need to change. This isn't the first time I've been at the Exemplar Global Food Safety Expo. I did present at the 2019 one, where the title then was, Are We There Yet? Where we were looking at food safety certification, where we were, the background, the history of food safety certification, where we are now in terms of our performance as an industry, as a food safety certification industry, and where we're going to be in the future. And at the last part of that, we suggested, is accredited certification of food safety management systems still the best approach to meet the combined contemporary challenges, the current day challenges of not only food safety, but sustainability and food security as well. Back then, we looked at the 90s, the evolution of food safety management standards in that decade, and it was a major decade, the 90s. And some of the trigger factors that prompted that activity, the UK Food Safety Act in 1990, some of the foodborne illness outbreaks, Jack in the Box outbreak in the US, Garibaldi here in Australia, the BSE, mad cow disease, and the evolution from the 80s, where we were looking at inspections and audits on hygiene and sanitation, maybe a little bit in quality control. The emphasis was on total quality management. We saw ISO 9000 published in around about 1987, and that seemed to take over. It was a systems approach, but not necessarily applicable to the food or agricultural industries. SQF came around in 1995. Codex was finally published in 1997, Europe GAP, which became Global GAP in the same year, and BRC. So in that whole 90s, we had a plethora of food safety standards to try and replace the second party and non-accredited third party standards that were already evolving within the industry. Moving into the noughties, into the early 2000s, and GFSI was trying to consolidate that. And with the intentions, with the hopes, with the objectives of reducing foodborne illness, reducing food recalls and warehouse withdrawals, improving consumer trust, improving public health, and sometimes there has been, a mixed objective on whether we're looking at just improving consumer trust or improving public health, and also to try and obviously to ensure the supply of food safety. We also back then, and these are taken from the presentation back in 2019, we also looked at the increasing complexity. We'd gone from, as I indicated, sort of hygiene audits, GMP audits, sometimes we're called, but just basically, inspections of the floors, walls, and ceilings. And HACCP had come along. We started looking at HACCP as the opportunity, as the panacea to fix all the problems of getting sites to implement HACCP and auditing HACCP. We moved to a systems approach, particularly when ISO 9000 came in the late 80s and the early 90s. Then, of course, we moved to the other systems that I just mentioned. Then it became allergen management. Then it became food fraud. Then it became food defense. And now we're talking about food safety culture as the need to move forward. So as it's progressed, we've seen more pass-fail audits. We've seen more reliance on the certificate for market access. We talk about certification audits, and the reliance very often is on the certificate just for market access into the food supply chain. We're seeing more dependence on scored audits. We're seeing stricter requirements for schemes, for CPOs, as we call them now, for certification bodies, and harder auditor criteria. So what are the KPIs we've got for food safety management systems in general, and particularly for food safety certification? What are our KPIs, and have we achieved them? Is it the number of certified sites? Is that our KPI? Easy to measure. We know for each of the schemes and for GFSI how many certified sites there are. Number of qualified auditors. Or is it the reduction in foodborne illness, the improvement in public health? Is there a reduction in foodborne illness? Is there an improvement in public health? Harder to measure. Sometimes it can be measured within particular jurisdictions, whether they're state or federal, but not always on a global sense in terms of the impact of food safety certification. According to the WHO, the World Health Organization, back in 2015, globally, almost 1 in 10 people fall ill every year from eating contaminated food, and 420,000 die. In the Americas, 77 million people fall ill every year from contaminated food, estimated 9,000 deaths. In Europe, the equivalent numbers are 23 million, 5,000 deaths. And those are all from World Health Organization figures. So really, we don't seem to have a major impact. Now, there are reasons for that, understand, but we don't seem to have been successful in meeting that KPI. Reduction in food recalls and warehouse withdrawals. Well, the number of recalls coordinated by Food Standards Australia and New Zealand between January 2010 and December 2019 has risen. And I would suggest that that's not much different in the US or Europe. Now, again, the reasons for recalls have increased. The likelihood of recalls and warehouse withdrawals have increased. But again, the number is not going down, the graph is going up. Reduction in regulatory oversight? Well, yes, there has been some. There has been a move towards private-public partnerships, but it's been very slow. Some European countries, in Canada, there's a recognition of GFSI certificates. There is more of a public-private arrangement in the US now and in other jurisdictions, but still very, very slow. Is there a reduction in the number of audits? One certified, accepted everywhere, which used to be the GFSI slogan when it first started in the year 2000. One certified, accepted anywhere. You don't hear it mentioned anymore. So it's not as if we've reduced the number of audits. Is there a return in the investment made by food businesses in the food industry in food safety management? Is there a reduction in food waste, improvement in productivity? Now, for a lot of businesses, yes, there is, but not for all businesses. And for the industry as a whole, we have to question whether we're going down the right pathway. Certainly it was applicable back in the 80s and 90s. It was certainly the most appropriate way, but maybe it's time to reconsider the approach we're taking to food safety management and food safety controls throughout the food industry. So when you look at where we are, emerging food safety threats are one of the reasons why we may not have met the KPIs that we should have set ourselves. Certification for the wrong reasons. Businesses getting into food safety certification, or sometimes multiple certifications for the wrong reasons, mainly just to get access to a particular market. Reliance on scores and ratings rather than outcomes. And we've seen that from a lot of our retail partners who are just looking at supply from sites that have got high audit scores or ratings rather than looking at the outcomes. What's wrong with a site getting, I don't know, 20 non-conformances in their first audit? Anything wrong with that? No, as long as they correct them, they fix them up, and they don't get the same 20 non-conformances next time. That's really what accredited certification is supposed to be about. Using a stick rather than a carrot approach, a punitive approach. We're hitting people over the head. I know that audits are supposed to be about improvements as well as identifying non-conformances, but very often it's the non-conformances that are paid attention to rather than looking at the improvement, the changes that sites have been taken. Poor audit processes. Very often criticized in the past, and this isn't, this isn't a case of auditor bashing. It's not very often auditor competence that's the issue. It is audit competence. Not enough time, not enough training, not enough resources, and for auditors. And sometimes it is, incompetence of auditors. But largely, it's looking at the audit processes and whether they're giving the required results. Misalignment between standards and regulations. Regulations underpin all the GFSI standards, but sometimes there's a misalignment between the standards. The standards aren't keeping up with the regulations aren't keeping up with the standards. Gaps in the supply chains. We pick on the producers, we pick on the manufacturers, but the transporters, the distributors, the storage facilities, the retailers, the food service organizations, where sometimes it's where a lot of the foodborne illness comes from, are perhaps not as given as much attention as the manufacturers and the producers. Abdication of responsibility to standard owners. Now, ultimately, it is the site, it is the management of the site that is legally responsible for the safety of the product. But very often we're saying, no, this is how you've got to do it. You've got to do it this way. You've got to do it our way. And constantly changing food safety management system requirements. Now, all this I covered a couple of years ago. Whether you were there or not, whether you listened or whether you were interested or not. That's what we were talking about a couple of years ago. 2 years later, what's changed? Well, obviously the pandemic has had a major impact on the food supply chain and a major impact on food safety audits. Just talking to a certification body recently, we were saying some of their planners, their food planners, are just going crazy. It's like a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle that they throw up in the air. They try and fix it one day, and the next day it's all changed because of lockdowns, because of whatever. So there's been a major impact on the food supply chain. It hasn't finished yet. Also a major impact on food safety certification, food safety audits. And also auditor availability is becoming an increasing, it's not just a new problem, but it's increasing in its relevance to the industry. As auditors age, the auditor cohort ages and retires, and is not necessarily being replaced as we would like. And obviously the other thing that hasn't changed, but is getting much more attention now, climate change and the recognition of food waste and sustainability. So firstly, the impact of COVID. Obviously, the world has changed. It's not only a health impact on so many people in so many countries, it's a major economic impact on trade, social impact as families have been separated, people can't see their friends, communities have been shut down largely as a result of the pandemic. We've been very fortunate in this country, but it still had a major impact on the community, the economy and the trade even in Australia. Impact in the food supply chain, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Impact on certification, on auditing, the way GFSI's handled it, the way the CPOs, the schemes have handled it, certificate extensions, retailers worrying about the continued food safety efficacy of their supplies. And also, we've been looking for a while at where do we go from here? Is this going to result in permanent changes in the food supply chain? Changes in eating habits? Changes in the certification process? There's been a major move towards remote audits. Are remote audits the way forward post the pandemic? So yeah, changes in impact in the food supply chain. Farm production has faced major bottlenecks for some inputs, mainly labor. Some farm sectors are more dependent on seasonal labor than others. Fruit and vegetables, more labor intensive in terms of picking, and because of travel limitations, that hasn't been possible. The labor hasn't been there. Processing has been disrupted by labor shortages, by shutdowns, by inability to get materials in. They've been affected by rules on social distancing, by labor shortages due to sickness, by lockdown measures, by trying to keep their labor safe. And modes of transport have been affected by COVID. Consumer demand has been seen rapid and unprecedented shifts. Away from restaurants. Restaurants haven't been there, they've been shut down. And from food service and other types of food away from home towards food consumed at home, requiring important changes in the way food supply chains operate. According to the OECD, the risk to food security currently does not come from disruptions along the supply chain, but rather from the devastating effects of COVID-19 on jobs and livelihoods. So yeah, major impact on the food supply chain is still continuing. And of course, the impact on food safety audits, no visitor policies, which continue to this day in many jurisdictions. Lockdowns, travel restrictions, auditors not able to travel from one state to another, or from one region to another. Risk assessments being done to see whether the product is still going to be safe if there is an extension request put in. Hybrid audits that are being done partly on site and partly remotely. The use of ICT, information communication technologies in audits. And of course, the push towards fully remote audits, which apply and are widely accepted in other certification audits, but in food safety audits, not so much so, because there's still a need for someone to go on site to make sure that they can see, touch, hear, smell what's happening within that facility. GFSI in October 2020 advised that certificates may be extended for a period of 6 months if the CPO, that's the scheme owner, considers it a suitable option for their program and based on risk assessment. Does not fully recognize fully remote food safety audits. So there is an ongoing and lasting impact. There is now a backlog of audits to be done. Certificate extensions, which are up to 6 months, are now running out, have run out and continue to run out. And sites are now looking at where do they go from here. Auditor availability was the other thing. Auditor numbers are decreasing. The average age of auditors in 2019 was 57.5. So in 2021, it's closer to 60. There are increasing auditor qualification criteria, and that's not changing. And auditor qualification criteria are partly GFSI and partly scheme by scheme. Many auditors complain that there's no career path. Many are accidental auditors. They've moved from manufacturing, they've moved from technical, they've moved from industry, they've moved from regulatory into an auditing path. And very often it's the auditor who's blamed if something goes wrong. And so it can have negative implications. And of course, it's not a socially desirable career for people who want to settle down with a family. There are a number of options and initiatives that are being considered in different parts of the world on how to improve the availability and the likelihood of young technical people coming into the industry. FIAL has one here in Australia. The IAAR Auditing Apprenticeship Program applies in the United States. There's a GFSI working group on auditor training and professional development, which is not looking at increasing the cohort of auditors, but the competence of auditors. And of course, Exemplar has its own programs, and there are a number of other initiatives. But we're not necessarily looking at the overall picture of how to offer young, technical, competent people a career into auditing. And again, do we need to change the audit process to accommodate the changing needs of these young professionals coming into the industry? Climate change, again, this is not new. Climate change has been around, unfortunately, for a long time. But it's now becoming much more of a need, I guess more of an urgency. And we need to recognize the impact that is going to have on the food industry. This is back in 2009, How to Feed the World in 2050. Climate change is likely to diminish continuous progress in global food security through production disruptions, leading to local availability limitations and price increases, etc., etc., etc. So it is a real concern. And we're seeing that in more extreme events happening right throughout the world. Climate change, runoff water contamination, pest contamination, increased challenge of food fraud, etc. Again, from PwC in 2015. And I love this quote because this was back in 2018 from one of the Californian fire captains. Extreme is a new normal for California wildfires. Remember, this was in 2018. It is now a new unprecedented every year. And that same Californian fire captain could have said the same thing in 2019, 2020. Same applies here. We've just had 71, I think, homes lost in Western Australia through bushfires, what we call wildfires in Australia. So we're getting much more extreme typhoons, fires, floods, etc. events, which is having a major impact on food security and food sustainability as we move forward. So where do we go from here? And what is the role of technology? Now, as I said, if you Google the future of auditing, you'll find 1,001, actually millions of different results on the future of food safety auditing. Not all related to food safety, but they're all there. Everyone's got an idea. Everyone's got a particular axe to grind, a particular bias in what they want to look for, or a particular product or process or service that they want to push. There are a number of very good initiatives that are happening within the food certification industry and the food regulatory industry on improving food safety and food safety initiatives. One of them, obviously, is the New Era for Smarter Food Safety from the US FDA, which is looking at tech-enabled traceability, smarter tools and approaches for prevention and outbreak response, new business models and retail modernization, and of course, food safety culture, which is now embedded in all the food safety certification standards. So that is being pushed forward within US and North America, and will have an impact on regulatory compliance and regulatory systems throughout the Western world, at least. GFSI is looking at its race to the top for food safety, which is largely about improving their product groups in terms of GFSI certification and GFSI benchmarking, developing harmonization and benchmarking requirements, moving to deliver a process of ongoing assessment and continuous alignment, developing a collaborative approach to the management of CBs between certification bodies, accreditation bodies, and GFSI, which tends, by the way, to duplicate what's already happening within the accreditation system, but that's personal view, and developing a certificate platform enabling access to certificate data for all organizations certified to a GFSI benchmarked recognized program. So yes, there's a number of initiatives happening, but are we looking at the KPIs, the success factors for the food certification industry as a whole, and looking at how we take that forward to integrate sustainability, security with food safety? IAF, which is the International Accreditation Forum, which is the sort of peak body, the governing organization for all in-country accreditation bodies, is looking at remote activities, remote auditing activities, as they relate to food safety audits. Obviously, the IAF is considers all types of accreditation, but they have a working group specifically on food safety audits. And their position just now is that remote auditing activities are established to complement the overall audit process, not replace it. Food safety certification scheme owners can call up the relevant reference documents, and I'll come to one of those in a minute, on remote auditing activities. Product or process certifications may also require specific testing or inspection activities, including on-site, which is where GFSI is coming from, that may not be possible to undertake remotely. And I guess that is the holdback issue in terms of food safety auditing, food safety certification. Yes, the industry, the certification industry, GFSI is comfortable with using information communication technology as long as it's applicable, as long as it's available, as long as it's secure, but they still want an on-site component. IF refers to its mandatory document for the use of ICT for auditing purposes. This covers all auditing, but it's also being applicable and being used, and GFSI is encouraging its use within the food certification industry. Certification bodies to document the risks and opportunities, check that the client and the certification body have the necessary infrastructure. Just came across an example of that recently where a rurally based site doesn't have the necessary infrastructure to support the use of ICT. Identify the extent to which ICT will be used. Auditors and other involved personnel must have the competency and ability to understand and utilize the information, and audit reports and related records shall indicate the extent to which ICT has been used. So ICT and the use of technology is being encouraged, but it cannot be for the whole audit. And GFSI has now incorporated that into their requirements, into the GFSI 2020.1. I won't read the whole thing, but basically at least part of the annual full audit shall be carried out on site. They're comfortable with the use of ICT technology for part of the audit, but at least part, and they're suggesting 50% of the audit must be conducted on site. So the stillness needs to be the visual inspection, the ability for auditors to conduct on-site parts of the audit. So that's what's happening now, and that will probably continue beyond the pandemic. As the pandemic drifts away, we will probably see large chunks of food safety audits being done remotely using ICT, as long as the security issues can be overcome, the availability issues can be overcome. But long term, do we need more carrot, less stick approach to food safety auditing. What do I mean by that? Do we need to re-engineer the process? Let me look at firstly the standards, or standards or guidance side of the equation, and then we'll look at the auditing side of the equation. Is there an argument to suggest that we need to cover the basics? We need to make sure that the food safety systems we have in place, the standards we have in place, continue to have flexible content to reduce the incidence of foodborne illness and recalls as some of the new food safety hazards appear. A few years ago was allergens, it was listeria, it was E. coli that were suddenly emerging as food safety threats, or suddenly being noticed as food safety threats. We need to be able to adapt and be flexible to pivot to adopt those requirements. That standards should consider not just consumers, but public health. So should issues of obesity, sugar reduction, salt reduction, health concerns be included, as well as just looking after the interests of consumers. Redefine food safety to include health, but also to include sustainability, food security, ethical issues, so that it's comprehensive, so that we're not taking a silo approach to separating food safety and sustainability, separating food safety and food security. And sometimes they can be contradictory in their approach, but redefine food safety to include. So we're not just looking at control over microbiological, chemical, or physical hazards anymore. We're looking at taking a holistic approach to the future of the food industry, including safety, security, and ethical issues. Focus more on a whole supply chain approach rather than site food safety, and modifying standards and regulations that do little to improve food safety, but encourage wastage. So modify standards and regulations so we're taking an approach that does not sacrifice food production in terms of maintaining food safety. On the other side, rather than just auditing, maybe it's auditing or assistance. Unfortunately, the model we have just now does not allow auditors to consult. Understandable under the existing accreditation certification system. But what if we were to re-engineer the audit process to be more supportive, less punitive, to enable ownership, allow businesses and sites to customize the standards to their own needs, provide a more consultative approach, mentoring rather than just auditing, again, supporting rather than a punitive approach, fewer auditors, but more qualified auditors, and whether you call them auditors, consultants, mentors, I'm not sure what, but fewer, but there can be some self-assessment requirement in there, but we don't need to have necessarily an audit every 12 months. Sites need to take, and businesses need to take ownership of their own process moving forward. Measure success and growth, not just failure. It's not just the number of non-conformances or the level of rating they got on a score. Measure the success and the growth of the systems within businesses, not just the failures. And have a progress report rather than certificates. What's the value in a certificate? You put it on the wall, you give it to a retailer, but have reports on improvement rather than certificates. And I know this seems out of the box, but the whole argument and debate around food safety culture sort of moves us in that direction, allowing sites and businesses to take responsibility for their own outcomes. So taking a developmental rather than punitive approach. So looking at the future of food safety, is technology the answer? Technology will continue to develop as a valuable tool, both for the food and agricultural industries, already is. There are many, many worthwhile initiatives, not only in the food processing industry, but in agricultural industries where technology has been put to good use. It will also be increasingly used in the food certification industry. We're seeing that now with the increase in ICT. That will develop. It will become more security. It will become more available. The tools, the vehicles for providing technology will be more available, but they are just tools. The food certification process cannot just fully rely on technology. It needs to, as I say, I think we need to change, we need to review, we need to re-engineer the process. So is the system broken? That's the food certification system broken? No, but it does need a reboot. And that's not just as a result of the pandemic, in my view. It's the result of the fact that we've now been going for 30 years. We don't necessarily measure our KPIs, let alone look at whether we are improving or going backwards. And we do need, and our resources, our auditor resources are declining. The number of auditors available are declining. So I feel that, and hopefully that this just generates discussion. You don't have to agree with me. I haven't given you my email address, but it's on the next slide. You can always send me an email if you don't agree with me, or you feel that you do agree with me and we need to look at moving forward. But I do feel that the certification system does need to have a rethink, a reboot, and a re-engineer. So thank you for listening. You have my email address there if you do want to contact me. And as I hand back to Mike, thank you for watching.
And thank you, Bill McBride, for that perspective on how technology can help improve the future of food safety auditing. And that concludes this presentation.